show you, because the amount of work that goes into the mixed media prints that you see in the other room is pretty complicated. It can sometimes be 15, 20 runs on top of the same print. I'm obviously not going to make you guys stay for like 20 prints. It's not what I'm going to do. What I'm going to do is show you a little bit of how my process works and how I combine different layers of prints to make some of the depth that you see in these kind of layers. And I'm only going to demonstrate the serigraphy part of it, which is the fancy word for screen printing, such that, because some of the other processes are more time consuming, so just give you a big picture idea of what I do and how. And so in my approach to the works that you see in this room, one of my main interests in, as far as developing my concept, was making these very flat, thin layers that become distilled down into this weird fictional kind of colorful sheen, and then I stack them on top of each other. So screen printing is actually capable of rendering something as beautifully, four color as this. In my case, I purposefully chose to separate the layers out and make them very static and very chunky and clunky, so that when they became stacked on top of each other, interesting things would happen with the transparent ink between each of the different layers. And so the way I do that is actually I should talk first actually. The images that are layered to create this particular series are sampled from my own video works, which are sampled from television. So some of you guys will say, I see Mr. T or whatever, and you're actually quite right, because I've sampled from a lot of 70s and 80s television, and then mutated them heavily into my own pieces. And then I take these guys back and I strip the layers back out into these flattened moments, recollection moments. The reason I do that is that I grew up in Los Angeles County, where they were filming all this stuff when I was a kid. And so I became fascinated later by the fact that there was no distinction between my reality and the fiction on television. And so part of this series is an investigation of what happens if I start to sort of break that down and strip it out and experiment with taking these moments and recollections of places, moments and recollections of places captured in fiction. What happens if I dice them together, and how do I do that? And for me, screen printing was the best method for doing that, because it can be so flat and strange and colorful and graphic, because it's really such a versatile medium. And the screen printing materials that we use here are all non-toxic. They're acrylic and water-based. So if any of you did screen printing, 25 years ago, it was all oil-based and horrible and toxic, and it would kill you. So we don't do that here. So the interesting thing is, all of those images that you see in the other room, can you kind of see the shapes on this screen? You guys can sort of see probably some of the landscapes that are actually depicted in that room. So I'm not going to demonstrate the process of putting these stencils onto the screen, because that's a long process. But what it is, it's actually a photosensitive process, not unlike photo paper, which is responsive to light. And what I do is I actually coat the screen with a thin, wet layer of this photo emulsion, and then I let it dry. And I take my masters, which are these guys, and they're actually transparent films, and I will actually lay them down as if I were a photographer exposing a screen, or exposing, a photo paper, with light going through it. So whatever's black actually blocks the light out and creates a stencil. And one of the cool things about this is it actually allows me to plan my images. As you guys can see, I can take 2 or 3 of these transparencies and get a pretty good idea of what would happen. What would happen if I printed these things in layers together. And of course, this is a very black, dense image. So imagine when I start to play around with color density, make it thinner, make it lighter, make it transparent, I can create a huge depth of play between each layer. I can take layers away. I can add different layers to it. And suddenly, I have this mysterious desert environment that comes out of this layered effect, right? So this process of putting the stencils on the screen happened, last month. And if you take classes here, I can show you how to do that. It's actually a lot of fun. What I'm going to demonstrate tonight is one of the ways in which I have 2 prints here that didn't make the final cut into the show. And I decided, let's print on those and see if we can do something with them. What happened is they started to kind of pull apart and get almost to the point where they were done, but we're going to see if we can resolve them tonight by choosing an image and dropping it down on top. So screen printing ink now is acrylic-based and water-based, and it actually washes up with soapy water, and it's very easy to clean, it's easy to work with. And you see some of the colors here that you probably can recognize in my prints in the other room. These are heavily mixed and combined. I've used color theory and I've made them quite transparent, such that some of these guys, if I were to test them on the obituary page here, which is sad, they look quite transparent, right? And I just do my finger test and see how transparent they are. The thing that makes screen printing ink transparent is this really wonderful product, which is an acrylic extender base. It's like a blank ink with no pigment, and it has this beautiful transparency that you can drop pigment into and it becomes alive as soon as you mix and combine. This is a screen printing board. It's a clamp board that you can actually clamp your screen into and print with. And so I will clamp this in. So let's do the street scene here at the bottom. You'll notice that tacky contact paper that everybody had in their kitchens in the 70s. It seems kind of fitting for my pieces. This actually, what this does is, if you'll notice, I actually expose two images on the same screen, and that's for economy and just ease of use. What I do is I print one side at a time. If they were very small images, I could put 5 or 6 on the same screen. So in this case, this is a landscape up here. We're not going to print this. We're going to print the little street scene down here. And so I block out what I don't want to print with contact paper because it doesn't actually damage the surface of the screen. And these guys are very tense polyester machine stretch screens. They can take a beating and they're really amazing to work with. And so I'll take part of this off because it's blocking some of the viewfinder, the rear mirror. So we'll just get rid of this one. And you can reuse these things too. So contact paper actually has a lot of uses in screen printing. You can block out elements and make new shapes and print them. So to print, I have to clamp this guy. Well, I don't have to, but I'm going to clamp it down in here pretty tight. And I should show you guys have probably seen some of the other pieces. There's 4 on the wall in there from the show. This is an example of one that I'm not done with yet. You can see a lot of different layers of screen printing. I work in a very free-form fashion where I drop layers down, I move the paper, drop it, move it, drop it, move it, drop it. And as anybody here at Newgrounds has seen me printing, has seen this entire room fill up with papers all over the floor and walls and everything. So I work very spontaneously when it comes to dropping layers down. However, I have a deep plan that goes into it before I start printing, as you guys probably are aware. So, I'm going to prop this up and make sure it's getting tight. Okay. And let's do, because of that image, let's do it dark. So I have this, let's see, I have this image here that has gotten a little bit lost. Like a lot of information is dancing around, it's not completely coalesced. We're going to print on top of that one. We'll use this one instead. Because we live in the desert, screen printing inks like to dry out like nobody's business. Before you know it, you're using chalk. It's terrible. So the first thing I do is I actually check the consistency, which actually looks sort of edible, right? Don't eat it. Yeah. So it's this looks pretty good, actually, surprisingly. I'll spritz a little bit of water in it. Because it's acrylic based, you can thin it a bit with water like you can acrylic paint, but you don't want to thin it too much because it'll start to pull apart and lose its integrity. So part of screen printing is learning to sort of intuitively respond to your inks, to recognize when the desert is causing your screen to dry out and you're going to lose your image, to see when things are going wrong and be able to correct them quickly. And anybody who's ever worked in lithography knows how things can go south really fast. The same thing goes for screen printing, which is generally pretty, I think, easy and fluid, but if you let things go south, they get bad really fast. So, and actually what we do, we actually are very generous with the ink. We're going to put a ton of ink here on the screen. I'm a pretty juicy screen printer. And I actually forgot to test the transparency. So this is a little more opaque than that one, right? And these are colors that I actually mixed to do some of the pieces in here, so you may recognize the colors. We're going to go ahead and put this on my new lab coat, which some of my students are like, that's a fresh new lab coat, or you washed your old one, I'm not sure. Yeah. So this is a squeegee. A squeegee is your best friend, it's your tool, it's what allows you to actually pull ink through the screen. And the thing is that this mesh is super fine, like itty bitty tiny little holes. the photo emulsion that I used to make the stencil that you guys did not see me demonstrate actually blocks out or fills in the mesh holes so that ink is only allowed to pass through certain parts of the image. And that's what actually will create our little street scene because parts of it are blocked out. So the first thing I want to do is I want to suspend a micro thin sheen of ink inside the mesh and inside the stencil so that when we print it, it drops down just enough but not too much because it'll come out and like do that crazy terrible thing and make your painting wet that you don't want. So actually what you do is you just grab this. Notice how the image already starts to look visible. Flip it around. That's called flooding the screen. What's happened now is there's a little bit of ink now suspended in that stencil, held in tension inside the screen. And so we're actually, can someone hand me that print right there?
Middle one?
Yes. Thank you. Perfect. So what I'm going to do first, before I just try to guess where this thing goes, I'm actually going to do a registration job, and I actually have a plastic sheet taped back here. I'm going to print on that first. To print, it's a quick, no holds barred, like that. Bam. And if you guys can see, I printed right on the plastic. So I'm going to pull the plastic back. So that's going to help me register. You'll see in a second. I know it's hard for you guys to see, but so I grab more ink and I flood it. Now you guys see the image up here? Okay. I'm going to take this guy and put it behind here. I know it's hard to see. You can flip this back over and I use it to align it so that I can find where I want this thing to go down. And you'll just have to trust me if you can't see. Or you can watch the video when we edit it. Alright, so now I've got my print that wasn't quite done. We're going to see if this completes it. Sometimes I get an idea and I'm like, yeah, that'll complete it. Other times I print it and go, nope, need something else. Take it, bam. And we've dropped another layer on top of it. And I think it's still lost, don't you guys? Still need something darker on top. So if someone can hand me a piece of paper behind them, it doesn't matter, grab one. I have some scrap paper there. I know it's spread out funny. I'll show you what this stencil actually looks like on its own when it's not on top of something else. So you can see how I drop layers, and sometimes, remember how that looked before? There were some firemen in front of a fire station. They kind of got pushed back and they disappear a bit, right? So when I'm creating these prints, I'm responding to the surface as it changes. I respond to my idea. I make adjustments. I decide this needs to go darker, this needs to go lighter. Sometimes you do break a print. It just gets ruined sometimes. Other times it gets so convoluted and then you drop a dark layer on top and it ties it all together and it's the best thing you've ever done. So this is what the actual image looks like. Right?
Cool.
So this might be my bottom layer, right? So I could build additional layers on top of this and do some really crazy, wild, wacky things with it. So, as you can see, if I have multiple different images, I can sort of play this kind of roulette where I'm like, yeah, this works on that. And as you guys saw my transparencies earlier, I'm not doing it completely blind. I've played around with what works on top of each other with what communicates with the other layers around it. So it's not purely a guessing game, right? It's kind of a knowledgeable, let's play around with it. So let's switch screens here and so what we're going to do is we're actually going to drop a dark layer on top of this one and that one. What do you think? Are you sure? Cool? All right. Cool. All right. So this is a very dark ink. I use this in a lot of the prints in the other room. It's a little thick. So it should be kind of the consistency of that awful Yoplait yogurt, that kind of horrible grossness. Yeah. Someone's like, I like Yoplait, stop it. Yeah. Let's pour this. Yeah. So this is kind of, if I recall, this was a relatively transparent dark. So what it's going to do is, when it lays on top of what we have in this print, it's going to do different things wherever it blocks out the pinkish color, and then when it sits directly on the white, it's going to have a different effect. And so this is the kind of language that you develop with color and transparency, that as you build layers, you can start to say, transparent yellow on blue actually does make green, or it does this strange thing with black, or it does, you start to learn the language of your colors and your prints. So remember, we have to flood the screen. There's the image, right? You guys see it? Beautiful, right? In fact, it's in that room. Flood it twice because I'm crazy that way. Oh, first thing we need to do is actually print on our registration sheet, right? So we get an idea of where it goes. Quick and easy. Go in and this is actually more transparent than I remember. It should be fun. So we're going to put this down. And so I flip this back so I can line up. I don't know if you can see that. Yeah. So can some of you guys see what I'm doing back here? So I can kind of get a guess of what it's going to look like once I drop it. Okay. Let's do it for real. Two layers. Interesting things start to happen in the areas. Go ahead and pass that around. It'll be dry in actually minutes. So, I mean, don't touch it right this second, but it'll dry out and even out. But you can kind of see what starts to happen, right? There's some mysterious things that are happening in the areas now where there's two layers of ink on top of each other. You can start to ask yourself, as you build an image, what dialogue needs to happen between yellow and blue and red and whatnot. So let's add another layer to something else. Let's.
I noticed that you didn't line up the original paper with.
That's right.
So why did
I did it. I lined it up with where I wanted the graphics to fall. So you could be very precise and you could line it up edgewise so that it has a beautiful, crisp, clean edge, as you see in these kinds of prints. Or you could be like this particular series. I wanted it to have kind of a thumbprinty, loose feel, and so I was less precise about edges. And so in this case, I was like, oh, I want the telephone poles to fall here, and so I moved it based on what I wanted the image to do. And I can get that. I can get a sense of what it's going to do by laying the transparency down and then moving the paper underneath it. Okay. Give it a little more pressure. There you go. So as you guys can see, that first we did 2 layers. Most of the ones in this room have no less than 7 layers. So they end up being 7, 10, 20, sometimes 30 layers of ink to get the kinds of effects that I want. So part of the process for me is an exploration of the surface, of the print, of the idea I have in my mind, and then I react to sort of the new shapes that emerge in these landscapes, and I start to play with them. So if that makes sense. That's all I had to show you guys. So. Cool. Thank you.